The world outside your window is quiet now, isn't it? Perhaps the gentle hum of a distant refrigerator, the soft glow of a street lamp, or the almost imperceptible whir of technology keeping watch over your slumber. It's a world that bends to your will, illuminated by the flick of a switch, warmed by a thermostat, and brought to life by the touch of a screen. You rise when your alarm demands it, perhaps a gentle melody, or a jarring beep pulling you from the depths of dreams. You have schedules, meetings, appointments, all meticulously planned, often stretching late into the night. It's a life of constant light, constant connection, a relentless march forward. But what if I told you there was a time, not so long ago in the grand tapestry of human history, when the world dictated the rhythm, not the other way around? A time when clocks were not tiny mechanisms on your wrist, but grand celestial bodies traversing the sky. A time when the concept of pulling an all-nighter was not a badge of honor for students, but a desperate, dangerous necessity. And perhaps, if you're still awake tonight, I can tell you something. Old. Very old. Something about why, for centuries, people didn't set an alarm, but simply rose with the sun. Imagine a world before electric lights chased away the shadows, before the soft glow of your phone screen was the last thing you saw before closing your eyes. Imagine villages shrouded in an almost impenetrable darkness once the sun dipped below the horizon, where the only illumination came from flickering hearths, the meager glow of a tallow candle, or perhaps a rushlight, barely pushing back the encroaching night. This wasn't just a lack of convenience, it was a fundamental shift in how life was lived. The night was a different entity altogether, a realm of rest, of silence, of potential dangers. For the people of medieval Europe, from the bustling market towns to the quiet, sprawling fields, the sun wasn't just a source of warmth or a marker of midday. It was the very pulse of their existence, the master conductor of their daily symphony. Their days were not measured by minutes and seconds, but by the arc of the sun across the sky, the subtle shifts in light, and the lengthening or shortening of shadows. It was a life intricately woven into the natural world, dictated by the cycles of dawn and dusk, the ebb and flow of the seasons. We, in our modern comfort, might find it hard to truly grasp this profound connection. We are insulated from the raw, undeniable power of nature. But for them, the rising sun was not merely a picturesque event. It was the signal for life to begin anew. It was the moment when the chill of the night began to recede, when the mist lifted from the fields, and when the tasks of survival, the very essence of their being, demanded attention. In the coming chapters, we will journey back in time, not to the grand battles or the towering cathedrals, but to the quiet, dusty corners of everyday life, to understand the subtle forces that compelled our ancestors to greet each day with the very first whisper of light. We'll explore the practicalities, the beliefs, the subtle rhythms that shaped their mornings, and ultimately, their entire lives. Prepare to step into a world where time truly began with the sun. The deepest hours of night had finally given way. Not with the sudden jolt of an alarm clock's persistent insistence, but with a gradual, almost imperceptible shift in the very fabric of the atmosphere. Inside the small, often windowless, or perhaps tiny-windowed, wattle and daub cottage, the air hung heavy with the earthy scent of wood smoke, damp soil, and the lingering warmth of bodies huddled together for comfort against the pre-dawn chill. A deep, primal quiet permeated everything, broken only by the soft, rhythmic breathing of a sleeping family. Perhaps the gentle rustle of straw as a child shifted in their slumber, or the distant, muffled snort of a tethered pig settling into its last hours of rest before the day's duties. The world outside, too, held its breath, cloaked in a velvet blackness that promised both profound rest and a subtle, almost spiritual apprehension. Then, a whisper. Not a sound heard with the ears, but a visual whisper, felt more than seen. Through the narrow gaps in the loosely woven thatch that formed the roof, or perhaps a single, small, unglazed opening that served as a rudimentary window, the first, faint suggestion of a lighter shade of black began to diffuse. It wasn't light in its full glory, not yet, but rather the subtle dilution of absolute darkness, a gentle bleeding of the night's inkiness into a nascent gray. This was the true, ancient alarm of the medieval world, a subtle cue that had been etched into the very DNA of humanity for millennia. There were no harsh electronic beeps, no vibrating phones demanding immediate attention, just the slow, patient, undeniable awakening of the world outside, urging life to stir with it. A lone rooster, somewhere in the village, offered a tentative, somewhat rusty crow. It was a hesitant declaration, perhaps testing the air. Then another, stronger, more confident, cut through the profound stillness, and another, until a cacophony, a vibrant chorus of defiant calls, sliced through the still, cold air, asserting the dawn's undeniable arrival. This wasn't merely a sound. It was an ancient, biological clock, a profound signal vibrating through the ether, calling to every sleeping soul that the world was stirring, that the time for quiet slumber was drawing to a close. Inside the cottage, eyes might flutter open, not wide awake immediately, but simply acknowledging the subtle change in light, the growing symphony of the morning. A man, perhaps the patriarch, might stretch, his joints creaking softly after hours of stillness on a simple straw mattress or a rough wooden cot. A woman might shift, perhaps reaching instinctively for a child nestled beside her, feeling the gentle rise and fall of their small, sleeping chest, a silent reassurance in the dimness. The air, though still imbued with the cool dampness of the pre-dawn, no longer held the biting frost of deepest night. A faint, almost ethereal, silvery light began to seep into the room, painting the rough-hewn timbers of the walls and the packed earth floor with soft, muted tones of gray and muted brown. Dust motes, previously invisible in the encompassing blackness, now caught these nascent rays, performing a silent ballet in the nascent light, dancing in columns of hazy illumination. It was a gradual unfolding, a slow invitation from the world outside, beckoning them to shed the cloak of sleep, to return to the conscious, demanding world. The human body, unburdened by the artificial schedules of later centuries, responded with innate harmony to this ancient call. The pineal gland, responding to the diminishing darkness perceived by the eyes, would naturally begin to reduce its melatonin production, allowing for a natural, gentle ascent from slumber. There was no struggle, no bleary-eyed fight against the persistent embrace of the pillow, simply a deep, biological recognition that the day had, imperceptibly, gloriously, begun. The very first task, almost universally, was the fire. During the long hours of the night, The embers in the central hearth would have died down to a mere whisper of a glow, or perhaps extinguished entirely if not carefully banked with ash before sleep. With a practiced hand, one of the adults, often the father or the eldest child, would quietly rise. The sounds would be minimal, careful not to disturb the still sleeping younger ones, the soft shuffle of bare feet on cold, hard earth, the gentle rustle of dried kindling being gathered, the soft scrape of a flint against steel, or perhaps the careful, patient blowing into a pile of ash, coaxing a dying ember back to a vibrant, life-giving flame. A small flame would flicker, hesitant at first, then grow stronger, casting dancing, wavering shadows on the rough-hewn walls, a warm, comforting, and essential presence against the lingering chill of the early morning. This wasn't just about warmth, though that was crucial. It was about light, about the preparation of the first simple meal of the day, and about the very center of family life, the hearth, around which all existence revolved. As the fire grew, spitting and crackling softly, so too did the sounds of awakening within the humble dwelling. A soft cough here, a long, languid yawn there. The low murmur of voices would begin, perhaps discussing the day's impending tasks, or simply sharing the quiet, intimate comfort of the dawn. Children, roused by the increasing light and the growing warmth from the hearth, would begin to stir, their sleepy eyes blinking open slowly, adjusting to the dim reality of the cottage interior. There was no rush, no frantic urgency in these first moments. The dawn was a gentle mistress, not a demanding master. The process of fully awakening was part of the daily ritual, a slow, deliberate transition from the ephemeral world of dreams to the tangible, demanding realities of medieval life. The world outside continued its symphony of awakening. Now with greater vigor, more roosters crowed, no longer tentative, but with full-throated, confident declarations of the new day. The distant lowing of cattle in their stalls, the plaintive bleating of sheep in the communal pasture, the excited squealing of pigs being roused from their pens for their morning feed. These were the rustic, authentic sounds that replaced the profound silence of the night. From neighboring cottages, faint, delicate trails of smoke would begin to curl upwards from chimneys or simple smoke holes in the roof, signaling that other families were also stirring, rekindling their own hearths, preparing for their own day's labors. A palpable sense of collective awakening permeated the entire village, a shared rhythm, a silent understanding that bound everyone together in the common purpose of survival. The dew on the grass in the fields and pastures would still be heavy, sparkling like scattered diamonds in the nascent sunlight, each tiny droplet reflecting the emerging brilliance. The air would be crisp, invigorating, carrying the earthy scent of damp soil, the sharp tang of wood smoke, and perhaps the faint, sweet perfume of blossoming wildflowers from the nearby meadows or orchards. For the peasant farmer, this was the absolute, undeniable signal to be up and preparing. Tools might be taken down from their pegs and checked for readiness. Animals fed their meager morning rations, and a quick, simple meal, perhaps a piece of hard bread or a bowl of thin porridge, consumed. There was no time for lingering over elaborate breakfasts. The unyielding demands of the fields, the hungry animals, and the very act of survival called with an insistent, biological urgency. The sun, climbing steadily, was their true taskmaster. The light itself was the most powerful and inescapable alarm. As the sun climbed higher, casting longer, sharper, and more defined shadows across the landscape, its intensity increased exponentially. It streamed through any opening, however small, painting broad stripes of nascent gold across the packed earthen floor, illuminating every dusty corner of the humble dwelling. It penetrated the eyelids, even when firmly closed, making continued sleep difficult, almost unnatural, forcing the body's internal clock to align with the external world. The energy levels in the body would naturally begin to rise, the mind would sharpen, and the lingering fogginess of sleep would dissipate under the invigorating, undeniable touch of the growing light. It was a daily rebirth, a powerful biological imperative. Even for those not directly involved in the arduous rhythm of agriculture, the call of the sun was absolute, setting the pace for all aspects of medieval life. The baker needed to rise early to stoke his massive brick oven to bake the day's bread, which had to be ready for the morning market. The blacksmith needed to be at his forge, rekindling the coals to work the raw iron into tools or repairs, his hammer blows soon echoing through the early air. The weaver had to prepare her loom, threading the bobbins and setting the warp, ensuring the day's cloth production began as soon as the light allowed for intricate work. The market square, silent and empty hours before, would slowly begin to fill with vendors setting up their stalls, their voices still hushed in the early light, gradually growing louder as the day progressed. Children would emerge from their homes, some to help their parents with chores, others to play simple games in the dust of the village paths, their laughter mingling with the sounds of burgeoning activity. The entire intricate fabric of medieval society was calibrated to this single, undeniable, majestic force: the rising sun. It was not a choice. It was the fundamental, unwritten law of their existence, a rhythm passed down through countless generations. And as the sun fully crested the horizon, casting its full, golden, life-giving glory upon the land, another day had truly, irrevocably begun, pulling every living soul into its timeless, ancient rhythm, a dance with the very source of all light and life. In our hurried modern lives, we are tethered, almost inescapably, to the relentless march of minutes and seconds. Digital displays glow from every surface. Wrists bear the weight of intricate mechanisms, and the very air hums with the precise, unyielding rhythm of synchronized clocks. We plan our days in 15-minute increments, rush to meet deadlines measured in moments, and feel a primal anxiety when our carefully constructed schedules go awry. Our lives are defined by a linear progression, a quantitative measurement of time that feels as absolute and unchangeable as gravity itself. But this omnipresent tyranny of the clock is a relatively recent invention, a mere blip in the vast expanse of human history. For the people of medieval Europe, from the humblest peasant to the loftiest lord, the concept of time was a far more fluid, organic, and deeply personal experience. Imagine a world utterly devoid of personal clocks, of wristwatches, of even the grand, intricate public clocks that would slowly begin to emerge towards the end of the period we are exploring. How then did they know when to rise, when to eat, when to work, and when to rest? The answer lay not in gears and springs, but in the grand, ancient mechanisms of the natural world. Their primary timepiece was the sun itself, a majestic, unwavering celestial clock that governed every aspect of their existence. Its position in the sky, the angle of its light, the length and direction of shadows it cast. These were the subtle, yet utterly reliable indicators that dictated the rhythm of their days. At dawn, as we explored in the previous chapter, the first blush of light was the undeniable call to wake. But as the sun climbed higher, casting its golden rays upon the world, its trajectory became the intuitive marker of progression. Mid-morning would be signaled by the sun being a certain height above the eastern horizon, its light warming the fields and stirring the dew. Midday, or noon in its original sense, from the Latin nona hora, the ninth hour, though its meaning shifted over time, was the sun at its zenith, directly overhead, casting the shortest shadows. This was often a natural break for a meal, a brief respite from the most intense heat of the day's labor. The sun's slow descent towards the west marked the afternoon, its lengthening shadows signaling the approaching end of the workday. And finally, the vibrant hues of sunset, followed by the rapid fading of light, were the unmistakable heralds of night, a clear command to retreat indoors. But the sun, while paramount, wasn't the only natural clock. The changing light of the sky itself offered constant cues. The soft gray of pre-dawn, the orange and pink of sunrise, the bright blue of midday, the golden hour of late afternoon, the deep blues and purples of twilight. These were not merely aesthetic changes, but vital, implicit measurements of time. The shifting patterns of clouds, the strength of the wind, the dew on the grass, the behavior of animals. A farmer would instinctively know the time of day by the way the cows began to stir, or the sheep gathered in their pens. This was a deep, intuitive knowledge, passed down through generations, honed by constant observation and absolute dependence on the natural world. Beyond the sun, the natural world also included the subtle, yet powerful influence of sound. For those whose lives revolved around the church, the pealing of bells from the local monastery or parish church served as a communal, audible clock. These were the canonical hours, a series of fixed times of prayer and divine office observed by clergy and often echoed, even if loosely, by the laity. Matins, before dawn; lauds, at dawn; prime, first hour, 6 a.m., terce, third hour, 9 a.m., sext, sixth hour, 12 p.m., none, ninth hour, 3 p.m., vespers at sunset, and compline before sleep. These ancient services punctuated the day. Even if an individual couldn't hear the distant bells, the collective rhythm of the community, guided by these bells, would shape their activities. The sound of the bells floating over the fields would signal the farmer to pause for a moment of prayer, or to shift from one task to another. It was a rhythmic pulse, binding the spiritual and the mundane. The seasons also played a fundamental role in shaping the medieval concept of time. Unlike our precise 365-day calendar, their year was experienced as a continuous cyclical progression, each season bringing its own unique demands and rhythms. Spring was the time of planting, rebirth, and renewed energy, with days gradually lengthening. Summer, with its long, abundant daylight hours, was the season of intense labor, of harvesting hay and tending crops, demanding the longest working days. Autumn brought the final harvests, the gathering of provisions for winter, and a gradual shortening of days. Winter, the season of cold, darkness, and scarcity was a time of reduced activity, of indoor tasks, and longer hours of sleep, where the very concept of time seemed to slow down dramatically. This intimate relationship with the natural world fostered a different kind of awareness. There was less anxiety about wasting time in the modern sense, but a profound understanding of its cyclical nature. Time wasn't a finite resource to be meticulously managed. It was an unfolding reality, a gift from God, to be lived in harmony with the divine and natural order. There was a deep patience born of this understanding, waiting for the crops to grow, for the weather to clear, for the sun to set. These were not frustrations, but inherent parts of existence. Consider the life of a peasant. Their day was entirely dictated by the light. When the sun was high, they toiled in the fields, plowing, sowing, weeding, harvesting. When it began to dip, they would gather their tools, bring in the livestock, and head home. There was no artificial light to extend the workday, no incentive to work past the point of natural illumination. To do so would be inefficient, dangerous, and often pointless. The fields themselves were their clock, telling them when a crop was ready, when the soil needed turning, when the animals needed tending. Their very survival depended on reading these natural signs accurately. Even in burgeoning towns and cities, the sun remained the ultimate timekeeper. Shops opened at dawn, their proprietors throwing open shutters to welcome the light and the first customers. Workshops hummed with activity during daylight hours, artisans relying on natural light for their intricate crafts. When twilight descended, shutters were closed, and business ceased. Social gatherings and communal activities largely happened during daylight or early evening, illuminated by the meager glow of hearths or a few precious candles. Public life, like agricultural life, mirrored the sun's journey across the sky. The very vocabulary of time reflected this natural connection. Instead of 9:30 a.m., they might refer to mid-morning, after prime, or when the sun is high. Phrases like from cock crow to dusk, or from sunup to sundown were not quaint idioms, but precise descriptions of their waking hours. It was a language rooted in observable phenomena, understandable to anyone who shared that intimate connection with the land and the sky. This profound reliance on natural time meant that life unfolded at a different pace. It was slower, more deliberate, less rushed. There was an inherent connection to the present moment, a mindfulness that arose from constantly observing and adapting to the immediate environment. The anxiety of being late for something was less prevalent, replaced by a deep understanding of natural cycles. If a task wasn't finished today, the sun would rise again tomorrow, offering another opportunity. This isn't to romanticize a difficult life, but to highlight a fundamental difference in how time was perceived and experienced. The absence of artificial timekeepers also meant a stronger sense of community. While each family had its internal rhythms, the village as a whole operated on a shared, intuitive clock. When one farmer began his plowing, others would soon follow. When the church bells rang, people paused. This collective awareness of natural time fostered a deep interconnectedness, a shared understanding of when to work, when to gather, and when to rest. It was a communal dance choreographed by the sun, the seasons, and the ancient wisdom passed down through generations. In essence, medieval life was a perpetual act of listening, listening to the light, listening to the sounds of nature, listening to the subtle shifts in the air. Time wasn't something they measured. It was something they felt, something they lived. It was not a series of distinct, divisible units, but a continuous flow, a grand, overarching narrative unfolding with each sunrise and sunset. To truly understand why they rose with the sun, we must first understand that the sun was not just an external entity. It was an intrinsic part of their very being, the beat of their lives, the silent, omnipresent conductor of their timeless existence. As the sun began its slow, inevitable descent towards the western horizon, painting the sky with hues of fiery orange, soft rose, and deep violet, a palpable shift would occur across the medieval landscape. The vibrant symphony of the day, filled with the sounds of tools clanking, animals calling, and human voices bustling, would gradually soften, giving way to a more subdued, almost introspective atmosphere. This wasn't merely the end of a workday. It was the onset of an entirely different realm, a world where the pervasive, comforting embrace of light gave way to the profound, often challenging dominion of darkness. For us, in our perpetually illuminated world, the concept of true, unyielding darkness is almost alien. We live under the constant glow of streetlights, the distant hum of city lights, the reassuring twinkle of electronic devices. A brief power outage is an inconvenience, a momentary dip into an unfamiliar void. But for the people of the Middle Ages, darkness was not an exception. It was the norm for half of every 24-hour cycle, a powerful, ever-present force that dictated behavior, instilled caution, and shaped the very rhythm of their lives in ways we can scarcely imagine. Once the sun had fully dipped below the horizon, and the last vestiges of twilight had faded from the sky, a profound blackness would descend upon the villages and towns. Imagine standing outside your humble wattle and daub home, the familiar path now swallowed by an inky void. The trees, once distinct against the sky, became monstrous, formless silhouettes. The air grew colder, carrying a crispness that hinted at the unseen presence of the vast, wild world beyond the village's meager defenses. The only sources of light available were incredibly meager, requiring conscious effort and precious resources. Inside the cottages, the primary source of illumination came from the hearth fire. This wasn't just a place for cooking or warmth. It was the heart of the home, its flickering flames casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls and low ceilings. The glow would be warm and inviting, but its reach was limited, illuminating only the immediate vicinity around the fire. Beyond that small circle of light, shadows deepened, swallowing corners and transforming familiar objects into indistinct shapes. Family members would huddle closer to the fire, not just for warmth, but for the comforting presence of its light, a tiny beacon against the vast, encroaching darkness. Beyond the hearth, other forms of artificial light were luxuries, or at best, temporary necessities. Tallow candles, made from animal fat, were common but burned quickly, produced a dim, smoky flame, and often smelled unpleasantly. Imagine trying to read or perform intricate tasks by such a light. It would have been a strain on the eyes and a costly endeavor. A single candle could cost a significant portion of a day's wages for a peasant, making its use sparing and purposeful. For most, candlelight was reserved for special occasions, or for brief, essential tasks after sunset. Even more basic were rush lights, made by soaking the pith of rushes in animal fat. These offered a very dim, sputtering light, barely enough to see one's hand in front of their face, and burned for only a short time. They were cheap and accessible, but provided minimal comfort against the overwhelming darkness. The idea of lighting up a room, as we understand it today, was simply not a concept. Most medieval homes were dark places, even during the day, with small or no windows to preserve heat and offer security. At night, they plunged into a near absolute gloom, punctuated only by these faint, often smoky, light sources. The limitations of light had profound implications for activity after sunset. Productive work largely ceased. Fine needlework, reading, if one was literate and had access to books, a rarity, or any task requiring precision simply wasn't feasible. The evening hours became a time for rest, for simple social interaction, and for the necessary preparations for the following day. Families would gather around the fire, perhaps mending tools, preparing wool for spinning, or telling stories. These were not hours of bustling activity, but of quiet contemplation and essential low-light tasks. Conversation might flow in hushed tones, the flickering light creating an intimate, almost dreamlike atmosphere. The darkness also carried a deeper, more primal weight. Fear. Without modern streetlights or security systems, the night was inherently more dangerous. Wild animals, desperate for food, might venture closer to villages. Bandits and outlaws found cover in the shadows. Even familiar paths became treacherous, a misplaced step potentially leading to injury or worse. Superstitions thrived in the gloom. The line between the known and the unknown blurred, and the medieval mind, steeped in folklore and religious beliefs, would often populate the shadows with spirits, fey folk, or malevolent creatures. The wind howling through the cracks in the walls, the creak of an old beam, the distant hoot of an owl. These sounds, amplified by the pervasive silence and darkness, could easily ignite the imagination, turning innocent noises into portents of dread. Travel after dark was exceptionally rare and undertaken only out of dire necessity or for clandestine purposes. Roads were unlit, uneven, and fraught with peril. A journey of even a few miles could become a life-threatening ordeal. This physical danger, coupled with the psychological fear of the unknown, effectively shut down movement between villages and towns once night fell. Communities became isolated islands of flickering light in a vast sea of blackness. The human body's response to this lack of artificial light was also significant. Without bright lights extending the day, the natural circadian rhythm was allowed to function unimpeded. As dusk approached, the body's production of melatonin would naturally increase, inducing a sense of drowsiness and readiness for sleep. This inherent biological programming, so often disrupted in our modern world, was the primary driver of their sleep patterns. The concept of staying up late was largely non-existent, unless for specific, pressing reasons like guarding against attack or attending to a sick family member. Even for those living in more affluent households, the lords and ladies in their castles, or wealthy merchants in their grand townhouses, while they might have had more candles or torches, the fundamental reality of limited light remained. Their halls would still be vast and shadowed, their chambers dimly lit compared to modern standards. The sheer scale of artificial illumination required to truly conquer the darkness was simply beyond the technological capabilities and economic means of the era. The vast majority of the population, however, experienced the night in its most unadulterated form, a period of deep, pervasive darkness, relieved only by the smallest, most essential glimmers of human-made light. This profound experience of darkness shaped social interactions and daily routines. Evenings were for quiet reflection, storytelling, and the simple joys of family proximity. They were not for public entertainments, bustling nightlife, or extended social events. The focus shifted inward, to the warmth and safety of the home. The psychological impact of living with such darkness year after year would have been immense, fostering both a heightened appreciation for the sun's return and a deep, ingrained respect, bordering on apprehension, for the mysteries of the night. It highlights just how fundamentally different their sensory world was from our own, a world where the distinction between day and night was not merely a matter of time, but a transformation of reality itself. When the sun dipped below the horizon, it wasn't just the light that vanished. It was a significant portion of their active, productive, and safe world that momentarily ceased to exist. In our modern world, the ideal of a perfect night's rest is often painted as 8 uninterrupted hours of blissful unconsciousness. We strive for it, sometimes desperately, buying specialized mattresses, blackout curtains, and noise-canceling devices to achieve this singular, unbroken stretch of sleep. If we wake in the middle of the night, it's often seen as a problem, an unwelcome interruption to be quickly overcome. We roll over, check the time on our glowing phone screen, and perhaps sigh with frustration at the perceived lost sleep. But what if I told you that, for centuries, waking up in the middle of the night wasn't just common, but an entirely natural and often productive part of the human sleep cycle? Welcome to the fascinating and perhaps surprisingly familiar world of biphasic sleep, or first and second sleep, as it was known in the Middle Ages. This concept, seemingly alien to us, was the predominant pattern of sleep for most of human history, particularly before the advent of artificial lighting. As we explored in the previous chapter, the medieval night was a realm of profound darkness, a stark contrast to our well-lit evenings. When the sun set, activities ceased, and the natural world plunged into an inky blackness, signaling the body that it was time to rest. People didn't fight this natural urge. Instead, they embraced it, often going to bed shortly after dusk, as soon as their chores were done and a simple evening meal consumed. This was the beginning of what was referred to as the first sleep. This initial period of slumber would typically last for about 3 to 4 hours, sometimes a little longer, depending on the individual and the season. Imagine the scene. The family, having gathered around the dying embers of the hearth, would gradually make their way to their sleeping arrangements. Perhaps a communal straw mattress on the floor, or simple wooden cots. The last whispers of conversation would fade into the pervasive quiet, and the heavy restorative sleep would descend. It was a deep, perhaps even dreamless sleep, designed to provide the initial burst of physical recuperation needed after a day of strenuous labor. The body, exhausted from manual work and the constant demands of a pre-industrial life, would quickly fall into this profound rest. But then, sometime between midnight and the early hours of the morning, something remarkable and entirely normal would occur. People would wake up. Not with a jolt, not in a panic, but often gently, naturally, as if moving from one room to another in a large, silent house. This period of wakefulness, which would last anywhere from 1 to 3 hours, was known as the waking hour or the watch. It was a distinct, recognized part of the night, not an error in their sleep pattern. Historical records, from diaries and literature to medical texts and court documents, consistently mention this practice, treating it as a given, a standard aspect of nocturnal life. So, what did people do during this waking hour? Far from being a time of restless tossing and turning, it was often a period of quiet, purposeful activity. Without the distractions of electric lights or external stimulation, the mind, having had its initial rest, would often be surprisingly clear and calm. This quiet interlude provided a unique opportunity for introspection and connection. One of the most common activities was simply tending to the fire. As we discussed, the hearth was the heart of the home, and its embers would need to be stoked, new wood added, to ensure warmth for the second sleep, and to prepare for the morning's cooking. This task was often done by the patriarch or matriarch, moving quietly in the faint glow. It was a meditative task, the gentle crackle of the wood and the rising warmth a comforting presence in the silent house. For many, this was a sacred time for prayer and spiritual reflection. Devout individuals might recite psalms, offer silent prayers, or contemplate scripture. With the world hushed and the distractions of the day far removed, the mind was particularly receptive to spiritual matters. Monks and nuns, following the monastic rule, would rise for vigils and matins, their chants filling the quiet cloisters, further emphasizing the sacred nature of this nocturnal waking. Even laypeople, if they were particularly devout, might use this time for personal devotion. This period was also a precious opportunity for social interaction and intimacy within the family. Couples might use this time for quiet conversation, sharing thoughts and concerns that the busy day had prevented. It was also a common time for marital intimacy, with historical accounts and even some medical texts of the era suggesting that this period, after the first sleep, was considered ideal for conception, as both bodies were rested and the mind unburdened. Families might also tell stories in hushed tones, plan for the next day's tasks, or simply share the quiet comfort of each other's presence in the dim light. Practical tasks, if absolutely necessary, might also be performed. A farmer might check on a sick animal in the barn, a mother might tend to a crying infant, or perhaps a craftsman might spend a few quiet moments contemplating a design or repairing a tool by the dim light of the hearth. These were usually low-light, low-impact tasks, not requiring the intense focus or physical exertion of daytime labor. It was a time for things that required quiet contemplation or gentle attention, not vigorous action. After this period of wakefulness, which could vary significantly in length, people would then return to bed for their second sleep. This sleep, like the first, would last for another 3 to 4 hours, carrying them through until the first hints of dawn. It was often described as a lighter, perhaps more dream-filled sleep, a period of mental recuperation after the initial physical rest. The body, having addressed its immediate need for deep rest, could now process thoughts, memories, and dreams. The eventual disappearance of biphasic sleep is largely attributed to the advent of artificial lighting, particularly widespread public lighting, and later electric light in homes. As cities became brighter and later night activities became possible, the distinct break in the sleep cycle began to erode. Taverns stayed open later, social gatherings extended into the night, and productive work could continue after dark. The concept of getting a good night's sleep morphed into a desire for a single, unbroken stretch, seen as more efficient and modern. By the 19th century, with the gas lamp and then electric light transforming urban landscapes, the practice of first and second sleep had largely faded from public consciousness, becoming a forgotten relic of a bygone era. Yet, evidence suggests that our bodies might still retain a latent preference for this ancient sleep pattern. Many people today experience nocturnal awakenings, often feeling anxious or frustrated by them. Perhaps, rather than fighting against these natural urges, we might find a measure of peace in understanding that our ancestors embraced these waking hours, transforming them into opportunities for prayer, reflection, intimacy, or quiet work. The medieval night, far from being just a void between days, was a rich, complex period, and the practice of biphasic sleep was a testament to humanity's profound connection to the natural rhythm of light and darkness. It reminds us that our modern sleep habits are not necessarily the only way, or even the most natural way, to experience rest. In the silent, deep hours of the medieval night, after the period of first sleep had offered its initial heavy rest, and the quiet introspection of the waking hour had played itself out, the body would, as if on cue, once again succumb to the gentle embrace of slumber. This was the second sleep, a distinct and equally vital component of the biphasic sleep pattern that dominated human lives for countless centuries. Unlike the first sleep, which often felt like a profound, almost unconscious descent into physical restoration, the second sleep was frequently described as lighter, perhaps more dream-filled, and characterized by a different kind of mental and emotional processing. As the family members, having tended to their small tasks, offered their prayers, or simply shared a moment of quiet connection, settled back onto their straw mattresses or simple wooden beds, the darkness outside would still be absolute. There were no rising streetlights, no distant car headlights, no subtle hum of electricity to hint at the approaching dawn. The only light might be the faintest glow from the carefully banked embers in the hearth, a tiny, pulsating heart in the silent home. This sustained darkness was crucial. It allowed the body's natural circadian rhythms to complete their cycle, gently guiding them back into the restorative depths of sleep. This second period of sleep would typically last another 3 to 4 hours, sometimes extending closer to 5 during the long, dark nights of winter. While the first sleep focused on deep physical repair, shaking off the fatigue of the day's labor, the second sleep was often perceived as a time for the mind to wander, to process the day's events, and to engage with the mysterious realm of dreams. Folkloric accounts and anecdotal evidence from historical texts suggest that dreams from the second sleep were often remembered more vividly and sometimes even considered more significant or prophetic. This isn't surprising, as modern sleep science now understands that REM, rapid eye movement sleep, where most vivid dreaming occurs, often becomes more prevalent in the later cycles of sleep. The depth of this second sleep might have varied. For some, it might have been a continuous, unbroken stretch, while for others, there might have been brief, almost unnoticed micro-awakenings as the body gently adjusted itself. The overriding characteristic, however, was a profound sense of naturalness. There was no internal struggle to get back to sleep. The body simply knew what it needed, and in the absence of artificial interference, it followed its innate programming. The transition from wakefulness back to sleep was smooth, unforced, a seamless part of their nocturnal existence. As this second sleep drew to a close, a subtle yet undeniable change would begin to manifest in the external world. Somewhere, out in the fields, a solitary rooster might offer its first tentative crow, a slightly stronger, more confident sound than the earlier hushed calls. Then, the earliest, faintest blush of pre-dawn light would begin to grace the eastern sky. It wasn't the brilliant gold of sunrise, but a soft, almost luminous gray, slowly pushing back the inkiness of the night. This was the cue, whispered by the world itself, that the long hours of darkness were finally receding. Inside the humble cottage, this nascent light, however faint, would begin its gentle work. Even through tightly closed eyelids, the diminishing darkness would be registered by the brain. The body, having completed its full cycle of rest, would instinctively begin to stir. There was no need for an external alarm, no jarring sound to rip them from their slumber. Instead, the awakening was a natural, organic process, attuned to the rhythms of the sun. Muscles would subtly tense, a slight shift in position on the mattress, a deep, satisfying stretch as the limbs extended. The mind, having been processing dreams and thoughts, would begin to transition back to the waking world, not with a jolt, but with a gradual clarity. The sounds of the world outside would also contribute to this natural awakening. The earlier, tentative crowing of roosters would now be joined by a more robust chorus. The distant lowing of cattle, the rustle of leaves as a gentle morning breeze stirred, the first chirps of birds. These were the gentle nudges that signaled the day's approach. The air, though still cool, would begin to feel lighter, fresher, losing the heavy, stagnant quality of the deepest night. This sensory symphony, subtle yet persistent, served as the final gentle push towards full consciousness. As the first true rays of sunlight began to paint the eastern sky with hues of soft orange and pink, breaking through the last remnants of gray, the awakening within the cottage would be complete. Family members would rise, not grudgingly, but with a sense of quiet purpose. Their bodies, having enjoyed a full and natural cycle of sleep, felt rested, rejuvenated, and ready to face the physical demands of the day ahead. The lingering fog of sleep would quickly dissipate under the invigorating touch of the rising sun, replaced by a clear-headedness and a readiness for action. The simple morning rituals would then commence. The fire, already rekindled during the waking hour or easily brought back to life, would provide warmth and a place for the morning meal. Water, perhaps drawn from a nearby well the evening before, would be used for a quick, bracing wash of the face and hands. Breakfast, a modest affair of bread, porridge, or last night's leftovers, would be consumed quickly, designed to provide immediate sustenance for the impending labor. There was a directness, an unpretentiousness to these morning routines, driven by practical necessity and the urgent call of the fields. This natural awakening, guided by the sun and the body's innate wisdom, fostered a deep connection to the environment. People were intimately attuned to the subtle shifts in light, temperature, and sound that heralded the dawn. Their internal clocks were perfectly synchronized with the external world, creating a harmonious existence where their bodies and minds flowed effortlessly with the planet's rhythms. This wasn't a choice or a discipline. It was the default mode of human existence, a testament to how profoundly our ancestors lived in concert with the natural world around them. The transition from night to day was a daily rebirth, both for the world and for the individual. The darkness, with its mysteries and dangers, gave way to the light, bringing with it the promise of productivity, community, and safety. And the second sleep, often overlooked in our modern understanding, played its crucial role in this transition, allowing the mind its own period of restorative rest before the full demands of daylight reasserted themselves. It reminds us that sleep, for medieval people, was not a single monolithic block, but a nuanced, dynamic process, intimately tied to the very cycles of life and light. Their mornings began not with a jolt, but with a gentle, patient unfolding, perfectly in tune with the world they inhabited. Imagine, if you will, a vast, sprawling tapestry woven not with threads of silk and gold, but with the rich, dark soil of Europe. For centuries, across countless fields and meadows, this tapestry was the very foundation of life, its patterns dictated by the patient, unyielding hands of nature. The medieval era, from the 9th to the 15th centuries, was overwhelmingly an agrarian society. Forget the bustling markets, the grand cathedrals, or the clanging of knightly armor. These were mere embellishments on a fundamental truth. The vast majority of people, perhaps 80 to 90%, were peasants whose very existence was inextricably linked to the land. Their lives, their sustenance, their survival, everything hinged upon the success of the harvest, the health of their livestock, and the cooperative spirit of their small, interconnected communities. To understand why they rose with the sun is to understand the absolute, unyielding dominance of agriculture in their daily lives. The field was their clock, their calendar, and their destiny. Unlike our modern existence, where food appears magically on supermarket shelves regardless of season or weather, medieval sustenance was a direct, often precarious result of hard labor, meticulous observation, and a profound respect for the whims of nature. There was no escaping this reality. The rhythm of their days was not set by factory whistles or office hours, but by the natural cycles of planting, growing, and harvesting. Every sunrise was a fresh command, every sunset a natural closing, and every season a demanding supervisor. Consider the early morning, as the sun's first rays began to kiss the dew-laden fields. This wasn't merely a picturesque scene. It was the undeniable call to labor. The light was essential. Plowing, for instance, required clear visibility to guide the oxen or horses straight, to ensure the furrows were even, and to avoid damaging precious implements. The wooden ard, a simple plow that merely scratched the surface, or the heavier, iron-tipped moldboard plow, which turned the soil more deeply, demanded the farmer's keen eye. Errors in plowing could mean lost yields, a direct threat to survival. Sowing seeds, a delicate and precise task, depended on ample light to ensure proper distribution across the prepared soil. Broadcast sowing by hand, a common method, required a steady arm and good vision to scatter the precious seeds evenly across the often uneven terrain. Harvesting, whether scything ripened grain or gathering root vegetables, was an activity that simply could not be efficiently or safely performed in dim light. Sharp tools like sickles and scythes, heavy loads of sheaves, and the inherent unevenness of medieval fields demanded the full, clear illumination of the day to prevent accidents and maximize output. The type of work also shifted with the sun's journey, almost like a meticulously choreographed dance with the celestial sphere. Early morning, while the dew was still heavy and the air crisp, might involve mucking out stalls, a laborious and often unpleasant task, clearing accumulated waste from the communal barns where livestock were kept overnight. Animals, having stirred with the first light, would need feeding their meager rations of hay or fodder, preparing them for a day of grazing or pulling plows. Or perhaps, before the main field work began, a quick repair of a broken wooden handle on a hoe or a dull edge on a spade would be performed, using rudimentary tools in the pre-dawn glow of the hearth. As the sun climbed higher, reaching its mid-morning perch and casting shorter shadows, the truly arduous field labor would be in full swing. Men, women, and often children would spread out across the communal fields, their figures bent over the soil, their movements synchronized with the slow, deliberate pace of the oxen as they pulled the plow, or the rhythmic swing of a hoe as they weeded between rows. The midday sun, often at its most intense, usually brought a brief respite, a time for a simple meal, often just bread, cheese, and perhaps some onions or hard-boiled eggs, eaten in the scant shade of a tree, a hedgerow, or a nearby rudimentary hut. This allowed bodies, already taxed by the morning's exertion, a moment to recover before their afternoon shift. The afternoon sun, though less intensely hot than midday, still offered valuable hours of light. This was often a period for continued field work, pushing onward until bodies ached, or perhaps for tasks closer to the village, mending fences that had fallen into disrepair, ensuring livestock could not wander, drawing water from the communal well for household use and animal troughs, a repetitive but essential task, gathering firewood from nearby woodlands, a constant, arduous chore to feed the ever-hungry hearth, or tending to small kitchen gardens closer to the home, growing herbs and vegetables that supplemented the staple grains. As the sun began its steady descent towards the west, painting the sky with softer, more elongated shadows, the intensity of labor would begin to wind down. Tools would be carefully cleaned of mud and soil and stored away, often in a communal shed or a lean-to against the cottage wall. Animals would be gently guided back to their pens, their weary bodies ready for rest. And finally, the journey home would begin, often a slow, reflective walk across the fields that had consumed their day. The fading light was a clear, unmistakable signal that the productive hours were drawing to a close, and the increasing dangers and practical limitations of the night were rapidly approaching. A non-negotiable end to the day's toils. The sheer physicality of their lives cannot be overstated. From dawn till dusk, their bodies were quite literally the instruments of labor. There were no machines to ease the burden of digging, lifting, carrying, or turning the soil. There were no advanced fertilizers to magically increase yields from tired land, only the laborious process of spreading animal manure. Every task, from breaking stubborn, rocky soil with a mattock to grinding grain into flour by hand, was performed through brute force, skill, and sheer, unwavering endurance. This intense, almost brutal physical exertion meant that sufficient rest was not a luxury. It was an absolute biological imperative for survival. The body, pushed to its very limits during the daylight hours, cried out for the deep, restorative sleep that only extended periods of darkness, free from demanding tasks, could reliably provide. To deny the body rest was to risk illness, injury, and ultimately inability to work, a death sentence in a society so dependent on manual labor. The rhythm of the seasons was even more profound and inescapable than the daily solar cycle, forming the macro calendar of their lives. Each season brought its own set of critical tasks and challenges, dictating the overall intensity and focus of work across the entire community. Spring was a time of immense hope and renewed, almost frantic effort, plowing the heavy, winter-hardened soil, often still damp and cold, preparing it for new life. Broadcasting seeds, a hopeful act against an uncertain future, and carefully preparing the fields for the year's growth. Days began to lengthen, a visible promise of warmer times, and every available hour of light was precious, each minute spent wisely now contributing to future sustenance. Summer was the undisputed peak of intensity, the longest days demanding the most strenuous and continuous labor. Hay had to be cut and dried quickly before rains could spoil it, grain crops carefully tended, weeded by hand, and the first vegetables harvested. The sun was their constant companion, often a demanding, even punishing one, urging them to work tirelessly under its unblinking gaze, pushing them to their physical limits. Then came autumn, the season of the harvest, undoubtedly the most critical and emotionally charged period of the entire year. The success or failure of the harvest determined survival through the harsh, lean months of winter. Every able body, from the youngest child capable of gleaning stray grains left behind in the fields, to the oldest, most experienced member, would be out in the fields from the first hint of light until the very last glimmer of dusk. Grain was meticulously cut with sickles, then threshed, separating the grain from the chaff, and carefully stored in barns or granaries. Fruit was gathered from orchards and preserved, root vegetables pulled from the earth and carefully cellared. This was a relentless race against time, the approaching cold, and the ever-present threat of rot or vermin. It was a period of back-breaking, repetitive labor that stretched every sinew, tested every spirit, and often led to widespread exhaustion. The desire to maximize daylight hours during harvest was paramount, almost a sacred duty, as every extra sheaf of grain or bushel of apples meant a slightly greater chance of survival for the family and the community through the lean winter months. Finally, winter arrived, a period of relative dormancy for the fields, and consequently, for many aspects of human labor. Days were drastically short, profoundly dark, and bitterly cold. Outdoor fieldwork largely ceased, replaced by tasks that could be performed indoors, huddled near the precious hearth, mending tools for the next season, spinning wool into thread, weaving cloth on simple looms, making and repairing clothes for the family. While still productive and necessary for survival, these tasks did not demand the same relentless physical exertion under the sun. This was a time when the body could recover, when longer periods of sleep were not just possible, but absolutely necessary to conserve precious energy in the harsh cold and with scarcer, often meager, food supplies. The inherent lack of natural light significantly reduced the viable working hours, forcing a slower, more internalized rhythm, a time for stories, mending, and simply enduring until the rebirth of spring. This deep reliance on the land fostered a profound sense of community and cooperation that is difficult for us to fully comprehend today. Many medieval villages practiced a system of open field farming, where individual strips of land were intermingled within large common fields. Major tasks like plowing, which often required a team of oxen, too expensive for one family, harvesting, demanding many hands, and even managing common pastures for livestock often required communal effort, sharing plows, oxen, and labor. The shared rhythm of the sun and seasons strengthened these bonds of interdependence. Everyone woke together, worked together, and rested together, their individual fates intrinsically linked to the collective success and survival of their agricultural endeavors. There was no room for individualistic schedules or a 9-to-5 mentality. The village moved as one organic unit, synchronized by the celestial clock above and the demands of the earth beneath. The medieval peasant's life, therefore, was a constant, intimate negotiation with the elements, a daily dance with the sun. Their bodies, their minds, their very social structures were finely tuned to the planet's natural cycles. Rising with the sun wasn't a philosophical choice or a fleeting health trend. It was the most fundamental, practical, and unavoidable imperative for survival. It was a life lived in raw, unmediated harmony with the Earth's ancient beat, a stark contrast to our insulated, artificial world of schedules and electric light. They lived, literally, by the light of the sun, for without it, their world and their lives would simply cease to be, consumed by darkness and hunger. We've journeyed through the deep, natural rhythms of medieval life, witnessing how the sun and the raw power of nature dictated the daily existence of the vast majority. For the peasant, the rising sun was an undeniable call to the fields, a biological alarm clock that resonated with the very core of their survival. But medieval Europe was not a monolithic society. It was a complex tapestry of interconnected, yet profoundly distinct social strata. While the sun's ultimate authority touched everyone, its immediate impact, the how and why people rose, varied significantly depending on one's position in the feudal hierarchy. Let us now turn our gaze from the dusty fields to the bustling town square, the quiet monastery, and the imposing castle, to explore the nuanced ways in which different social classes experienced the dawn. The peasant, the sun's most faithful servant. As we've extensively discussed, the peasant truly was the most direct and unyielding servant of the sun. Their lives were a perpetual dance with the dawn. Rising with the sun was not a matter of choice, but of absolute necessity. Their work, plowing, sowing, weeding, harvesting, was wholly dependent on natural light. The early morning chill, the heavy dew, the first tentative sounds of farm animals stirring were their alarm clocks. They needed every available hour of daylight, especially during crucial seasons like planting and harvest. A peasant's day began before the sun fully cleared the horizon, and ended only as the last vestiges of twilight faded. Their homes offered little artificial light, making indoor work after dark largely impossible or impractical. The very notion of a leisurely morning was alien to them. Every moment of light was a resource to be exploited for survival. Their bodies were deeply attuned to the natural light-dark cycle, often resting in first and second sleeps to optimize recovery from strenuous physical labor. Their mornings were characterized by a quiet, determined preparation for a long day of toil in the open air, a life directly woven into the earth's timeless rhythms. The artisan and town dweller. The sun as business partner. Moving from the countryside to the burgeoning towns and cities of medieval Europe, we encounter a different relationship with the sun. While still heavily influenced by natural light, the necessity was often economic rather than purely agricultural. Artisans, merchants, and craftsmen formed the backbone of urban life, and their livelihoods depended on daylight for their trades. Imagine a blacksmith in his forge. While the glowing embers of his forge provided some light, the intricate work of shaping hot metal, tempering steel, and assembling complex parts required keen eyesight and ample natural illumination. His day would begin with the first hints of light, allowing him to stoke his forge, prepare his tools, and begin the noisy rhythm of hammer on anvil. To work in true darkness would be inefficient and dangerous. Similarly, a weaver needed light to thread her loom, to discern the subtle colors and patterns of the cloth, and to detect imperfections. A simple error due to poor light could ruin hours of work and waste precious materials. Her loom would be active from dawn until dusk, utilizing every ray. Merchants and shopkeepers also operated primarily by the sun. Shops, often open-fronted, relied on natural light to display their wares. Customers, too, would do their shopping during daylight hours, as navigating crowded, unlit streets after dark was hazardous. The opening and closing of market stalls and shops were directly tied to the rising and setting sun, their rhythms mirroring the natural world, albeit with a commercial twist. They might have used more candles or oil lamps than peasants, especially for specialized tasks or in wealthier establishments, but these were expensive and dim, rarely extending productive hours significantly. Their mornings would still involve rising with the sun to prepare their goods, open their establishments, and welcome the first customers, eager to conduct business in the clear light of day. For them, the sun was not just a light source, but an essential partner in commerce. The monk and clergy. The sun as spiritual guide. Perhaps no other group's wake-in life was as meticulously regulated by the sun, yet for spiritual rather than purely economic or survival reasons, as that of the monks and clergy. The monastic life, in particular, was built around a rigorous schedule of prayer known as the canonical hours, or divine office. These hours were explicitly tied to specific times of day, and by extension, to the position of the sun. Monks would typically rise for matins, vigils, in the dead of night, often around 2 or 3 a.m., long before dawn. This seemingly early hour was part of their spiritual discipline, a time of profound silence and prayer when the world was asleep, allowing for intense communion with God. However, the subsequent hour of lauds was specifically tied to dawn, literally meaning praises at sunrise. This meant that even if they had risen earlier for matins, the monastery would still respond to the sun's first light with a distinct set of prayers, often chanted as the first rays illuminated the stained glass windows of the abbey church. Following lauds, prime was sung at the first hour, around 6 a.m., just after sunrise. Terce at the third hour, around 9 a.m., sext at the 6th hour, around midday, and none at the 9th hour, around p.m. Each of these hours was marked by specific prayers, readings, and hymns, and their timing was directly linked to the sun's journey across the sky. Vespers was sung at sunset, a thanksgiving for the day's blessings, and Compline was the final prayer before sleep. While monks might have had access to more candles or lamps within their monasteries, especially in scriptoriums for copying manuscripts or in chapels for nighttime services, the overall structure of their day was a profound testament to solar time. Their waking hours were not dictated by manual labor in the fields, but by a spiritual discipline that nonetheless aligned perfectly with the natural cycle of light and darkness. Their mornings were a sacred awakening, a transition from silent contemplation to communal devotion, guided by the precise celestial clock. The nobility. The sun as a social marker. Finally, we turn to the nobility, the lords and ladies residing in their stone castles and manors. One might assume that with their wealth and access to servants, they would be immune to the sun's dictates. And to some extent, they were. They certainly didn't perform manual labor in the fields, nor did they depend directly on opening a shop at dawn. However, even their lives, though cushioned, were still fundamentally shaped by the natural light cycle, albeit with a layer of social custom and practical limitation. Nobles generally rose later than peasants or artisans. They had servants to tend to the fires, prepare their clothes, and bring them breakfast in their chambers. There was no immediate economic imperative to be up at cock-crow. However, their day still needed to align with the rhythms of their households and the activities that demanded light. Hunting, a popular aristocratic pastime, typically began early in the morning when the animals were most active and the air was crisp. Inspections of their estates, managing their lands, or presiding over local justice also required daylight. Meetings with vassals, visiting dignitaries, or military training would all largely take place during the illuminated hours. While they could afford more candles and torches, castles were vast, drafty, and difficult to illuminate effectively. The grand halls would still be largely in shadow at night, and artificial light, though available, was expensive, smoky, and dim by modern standards. Consequently, grand social events, feasts, and entertainments, while occurring in the evenings, would often conclude earlier than modern parties, simply because the logistics of lighting and warmth became prohibitive. Their social clock was still very much tied to the sun's presence. Their mornings, while more relaxed, still acknowledged the arrival of light as the beginning of a day of managing their affairs, engaging in social rituals, and often pursuing their leisure activities that were best enjoyed under the sun. In essence, while the peasant's connection to the sun was one of raw, immediate survival, the artisan's was one of economic practicality, the monk's one of spiritual devotion, and the noble's one of social custom and administrative necessity. Each class, in their own distinct way, was inextricably bound to the celestial clock above. The medieval world, across its diverse social spectrum, awoke with the sun, not by choice in a world of endless alternatives, but because the sun was the unchallenged, omnipresent master of their time, their activities, and their very existence. The nuanced differences merely highlighted the various facets of this universal truth. As the subtle, gentle awakening we explored in previous chapters gave way to the full light of dawn, the medieval European household would transition from quiet slumber to the practicalities of a new day. While our modern mornings are often a blur of hot showers, elaborate breakfast preparations, and complex grooming routines, the daily rituals of our ancestors were far simpler, dictated by the harsh realities of limited resources, rudimentary technology, and an overriding focus on efficiency for survival. The concepts of personal hygiene and morning meals, as we understand them today, were vastly different, yet equally essential for preparing the body and mind for the arduous day ahead. The morning wash, a simple necessity. Forget the steamy bathrooms, the myriad of soaps, shampoos, and lotions that fill our shelves. For the average medieval person, a morning wash was a far cry from what we consider a bath or shower. Water was a precious commodity, especially clean, potable water. It had to be fetched, often from a communal well or stream, carried in heavy buckets, and was rarely heated for routine washing, except perhaps for the very young, the very old, or the sick. Upon rising, the first order of business, after tending to the fire, would be a quick, bracing wash of the face and hands. A small basin, perhaps made of wood or earthenware, would be filled with cold water, likely drawn the evening before and left in the relatively warmer indoors to lose some of its icy chill. A rough linen cloth, or even just bare hands, would be used to splash water onto the face, wiping away the sleep and grime of the night. This wasn't about deep cleansing. It was about waking up, refreshing the senses, and a basic removal of surface dirt. The sensation of cold water on the skin would have been an invigorating jolt, a physical awakening that perfectly mirrored the light's transition from darkness to dawn. The concept of daily full-body bathing was uncommon, reserved perhaps for special occasions, religious purification, or medical necessity, and was often done in public bathhouses, where available, rather than at home. Beyond the face and hands, personal hygiene was generally more focused on practicality. Clothing, often worn for days or even weeks between washes, provided a barrier against direct skin contact with dirt. Hair might be brushed with simple wooden combs, but elaborate styling was non-existent. Oral hygiene was rudimentary at best. While some might chew on herbs or use rough cloths to wipe teeth, the concept of regular brushing was centuries away. The goal was simple: to feel refreshed enough to begin work, not to achieve a state of pristine cleanliness by modern standards. The sense of wood smoke, damp earth, and honest toil were the prevailing perfumes of the medieval morning. The morning meal. Sustenance over culinary delight. Once the brief ritual of washing was complete, attention would quickly turn to the day's first sustenance. The medieval breakfast, a term that only came into common use much later, was not the varied, often sweet and leisurely meal we enjoy today. It was a utilitarian affair, focused entirely on providing the necessary calories and energy for the strenuous physical labor that awaited them. It was about breaking the fast of the night, simply and efficiently. For the vast majority, the peasants, the morning meal was remarkably simple and repetitive. The staple was almost universally bread. This wasn't the refined white bread we know. It was a dark, dense, coarse loaf, often made from rye, barley, or a mix of grains, maslin, sometimes mixed with oats or even peas, especially in leaner times. It was the staff of life, providing essential carbohydrates and fiber. This bread would likely be hard, perhaps even stale, from the day before. It might be softened by dipping it in water, ale, a common low-alcohol beverage consumed by all ages, or a thin, watery broth saved from the previous evening. Accompanying the bread might be a bowl of pottage or porridge. Pottage was a thick, savory stew, a staple throughout the day, made from whatever vegetables were available: cabbage, leeks, peas, beans, cooked slowly with grains, and sometimes a small piece of salted meat or fish if the family was fortunate. For breakfast, it would likely be a thinner, gruel-like version, perhaps warmed over the rekindled fire. Porridge was similar, usually made from oats or barley, cooked with water or milk, if available from their own cow or goat, and eaten plain. These were hearty, filling, and easily digestible sources of energy, crucial for sustaining hours of manual labor. Beyond these basics, additions were rare and seasonal. In summer, they might have a few fresh berries or a piece of orchard fruit. In winter, perhaps some dried fruit or a piece of preserved cheese. Meat was a luxury, rarely consumed by the peasantry except on feast days, or if an animal had to be slaughtered due to illness or old age. Eggs, if available from their chickens, would be a welcome but not daily addition. Milk was typically scarce, often reserved for making cheese or butter, and raw milk was not always safe. The meal would be consumed quickly, often standing or perched on a simple stool around the hearth. There was little time for lingering or idle conversation. The primary goal was to fuel the body for the day's tasks. The sounds would be of chewing, perhaps the clinking of wooden bowls, and the crackle of the fire. The air would be filled with the earthy scent of grain and the subtle aroma of wood smoke. The nobleman's breakfast, a touch of indulgence. While still far from a modern banquet, the morning meal for the nobility offered a distinct contrast. They would have access to a wider variety of foods, though convenience was still paramount. A nobleman might begin his day with fine white bread, made from wheat, a luxury grain, perhaps accompanied by cheese, cold meats from a previous feast, or even a game bird if hunting had been successful. Wine or ale would be the beverage of choice, not water. Spices, though expensive, might grace their dishes, adding flavor. Their meals would be served by servants, often in their private chambers, allowing for a more leisurely start to the day. However, even for the noble, the concept of a multi-course, extended breakfast was yet to evolve. It was still a pragmatic meal, designed to provide energy for their day of management, hunting, or social engagements. The monk's modest morning. In the monastery, the morning meal, if there was one, was governed by the monastic rule and the liturgical calendar. Often, the monks would have partaken in matins and lauds before the sun fully rose. Their first meal, called prandium or jentaculum, might be simple bread and ale, or a portion of gruel. During periods of fasting, Lent, Advent, meals would be even more austere, perhaps just a piece of dry bread. The emphasis was on spiritual discipline and sustenance, not indulgence. The larger context, practicality and survival. Across all strata, the morning rituals were deeply practical. There was little room for inefficiency or excess. Every action, from washing to eating, was geared towards preparing the body to face a world that demanded constant physical exertion and resilience. The lack of modern amenities meant that even simple acts required forethought, planning, and manual effort. The water had to be drawn, the fire had to be rekindled, the food had to be prepared from scratch using rudimentary methods. The morning light was thus not just a signal to rise, it was an activation trigger for a cascade of essential tasks. It brought visibility, warmth from the sun's direct rays after the initial chill, and the necessary conditions for work. The immediate consumption of a simple, energy-rich meal ensured that the body had the fuel to begin its demanding day in the fields, the workshop, or the castle halls. There was a direct, undeniable link between the rising sun, the simple morning routines, and the very act of sustaining life in a challenging world. It was a stark reminder that in the medieval era, every new day was, in essence, a renewed commitment to survival, begun with a clear, deliberate, and unpretentious routine. When we imagine a home today, we typically envision spaces filled with light. Large windows invite the sun, artificial lights chase away every shadow, and even the materials, pale paints, polished floors, are chosen to maximize brightness. Our homes are designed as havens of comfort and illumination, connecting us seamlessly with the outside world while providing abundant light for all activities. But journey back with me to medieval Europe and step inside the dwellings of the vast majority of its people. What you would find is a world fundamentally different, a realm dominated by shadow, where the very architecture seemed to conspire with the setting sun to plunge interiors into a perpetual, profound gloom. These were the dark houses, and their lack of natural light had an immense, often unseen impact on the lives of those who inhabited them. Let's begin with the very structure. For the humble peasant, which was most of the population, homes were typically small, single-roomed, and built from readily available local materials. Wattle and daub, a woven lattice of wooden strips plastered with a mix of clay, mud, straw, and dung, rough-hewn timber, or local stone. Roofs were almost universally thatched with straw or reeds, thick and insulating, but entirely opaque. The primary function of these dwellings was pragmatic, to provide shelter from the elements, warmth in winter, and security from intruders or wild animals. Light, in the modern sense, was a secondary, often negligible consideration. The most striking feature, or rather lack thereof, was the absence or scarcity of windows. Windows were expensive to construct and difficult to weatherproof. Glass, even in its crudest form, was a luxury beyond the reach of ordinary folk for centuries. Instead, windows, if they existed at all, were often mere unglazed openings, small slits cut into the walls. These openings would be covered, perhaps by a wooden shutter, a piece of stretched animal hide, or a simple cloth to keep out the wind, rain, and cold. During the day, these covers might be opened, allowing a meager stream of light and fresh, but often cold or dusty, air to enter. But at night they were firmly shut, creating an almost absolute blackout. Even in the brightest midday sun, the interior of such a cottage would remain dim, twilight-like, a stark contrast to the brilliant world outside. Consider a typical peasant home. Often there was no distinct chimney in the modern sense. A central hearth fire burned on the packed earth floor, its smoke either escaping through a simple hole in the roof, a smoke hole, or simply permeating the entire dwelling, slowly making its way out through gaps in the thatch or walls. This constant presence of smoke, while providing warmth and some light, also contributed to the dimness by coating surfaces in soot and creating a hazy atmosphere. The interior would be a canvas of muted browns and grays, the rough textures of timber and dried mud absorbing what little light managed to penetrate. Even the homes of town dwellers and artisans, while often larger and sometimes built with more durable materials like stone or brick, still suffered from significant light deprivation. Glass was slowly becoming more common in urban centers towards the later Middle Ages, but it was still a luxury, reserved for the wealthy or for smaller upper windows. Most windows in a typical merchant's house would still be shuttered or covered with oiled cloth or horn, which offered some translucence but severely limited the entry of bright light. Workshops, despite the need for precision, would rely heavily on strategically placed openings and, where absolutely necessary, expensive candles or oil lamps. Imagine a baker needing to check the exact shade of golden brown on his loaves, or a tailor meticulously cutting fabric. Every ray of natural light was invaluable. In the grand castles and manors of the nobility, the situation was marginally better, but still far from our modern expectations. While castles had more and larger windows, especially in their great halls and private chambers, these too were often unglazed or fitted with thick, leaded glass panes that distorted light and vision. Tapestries hung on walls to provide insulation, further absorbing light. Even a well-appointed medieval castle, filled with torches and candles, would have vast, shadowy corners, and the experience of darkness would still be profound once night truly fell. The idea of lighting up a large space effectively was simply beyond their technological capabilities. The constant dimness inside these homes had profound effects on daily life and behavior. Firstly, it actively pushed people outdoors. The interior was simply not conducive to extended periods of complex, light-dependent work. If you needed to sew, mend, read, if literate, or perform any task requiring visual acuity, you would seek the natural light spilling in from a doorway or, more often, take your work outside into the courtyard or field. This reinforced the sun's role as the primary locus of activity. Life was lived outside, in the full light of day, while the home served more as a refuge for rest and basic necessities. Secondly, it influenced social interactions. Evenings, spent huddled around the central hearth, were more about intimate storytelling, quiet conversation, simple games, or preparations for the next day that didn't require much light, like shelling peas or mending simple garments. The lack of bright light discouraged large, boisterous gatherings indoors. It fostered a closeness, a reliance on verbal tradition rather than written, and a heightened awareness of sound and touch in the dimness. Thirdly, and perhaps most significantly, the pervasive darkness had health implications. Lack of exposure to natural sunlight meant a significant reduction in the body's ability to synthesize vitamin D. This essential vitamin plays a crucial role in bone health, immune function, and overall well-being. Chronic vitamin D deficiency could contribute to conditions like rickets in children, causing bone deformities, and osteomalacia in adults, softening of bones, as well as generally weaker immune systems, making them more susceptible to infections. The paleness of skin often depicted in medieval art wasn't just an aesthetic choice. It reflected a reality of limited sun exposure for those who spent much of their lives indoors or under heavy clothing. Moreover, the constant dimness could have affected eyesight. While they didn't rely on screens, the strain of performing tasks in low light over generations could have contributed to vision problems, though it's difficult to quantify. The emphasis on outdoor, daylight activities would have provided some balance. But indoor life was a constant challenge to visual acuity. The psychological impact of living in perpetual twilight cannot be underestimated. While they were accustomed to it, the absence of bright, invigorating light would likely have influenced mood and energy levels. The modern concept of seasonal affective disorder, SAD, highlights how much human well-being is tied to light exposure. For medieval people, especially during long, dark winters, a pervasive sense of gloom, though culturally normalized, might have been a subtle undercurrent of their daily existence. The return of bright spring and summer light would have been a profound, almost spiritual relief, not just for warmth and agricultural opportunity, but for the sheer sensory joy of light. Finally, the design of these homes reflected a fundamental priority: conservation of heat and resources. Small, unglazed windows minimized heat loss in winter, crucial in an era before effective heating systems. Building materials were chosen for their insulating properties and local availability, not their ability to reflect light. The hearth, while smoky, was the sole source of warmth and light, centralizing life around it. This practical focus, driven by survival in a harsh climate, inadvertently created a world that maximized darkness indoors. Stepping out of such a dwelling into the full glory of a medieval sunrise, with its crisp air and brilliant illumination, would have been a profoundly transformative experience each day. It was a literal emergence from shadow into light, from dormancy into activity, from the quiet, confined space of the home into the expansive, demanding world. The dark house was a testament to the limitations and realities of medieval life, a stark contrast to our bright, open homes, and a constant reminder of how deeply our ancestors were bound to the natural rhythm of the sun, not just for work, but for every aspect of their physical and psychological well-being. In our individualistic modern world, where personal schedules often diverge wildly and our lives are increasingly lived in isolated digital bubbles, the concept of a truly collective existence might seem quaint, perhaps even a little suffocating. We value autonomy, flexibility, and the freedom to craft our own daily routines. But rewind the clock 1,000 years or so to the heart of medieval Europe, and you'll discover a society where the strength of the individual was inextricably linked to the strength of the community. This wasn't merely a social preference, it was a fundamental imperative for survival, woven into the very fabric of their agricultural existence. And, perhaps unsurprisingly, the sun, in its daily and seasonal cycles, played a central role in orchestrating this communal dance, ensuring that everyone woke, worked, and rested to a shared, ancient rhythm. The vast majority of medieval Europeans lived in small villages or hamlets, typically surrounded by the fields that sustained them. These were tight-knit communities, often with populations ranging from a few dozen to a few hundred souls. Life was public, visible, and deeply interconnected. There was little privacy in the modern sense. Everyone knew everyone else's business, their joys, their sorrows, and their struggles. This constant proximity fostered a powerful sense of mutual dependence, a collective identity forged in the crucible of shared challenges. The most profound expression of this communal living, and its direct link to the sun's rhythm, was in agriculture. As we've discussed, medieval farming was intensely laborious and often required more than one family's resources. Many villages practiced the open field system, where large, unfenced fields were divided into strips, with each peasant household holding scattered strips across different fields. This system inherently demanded cooperation. For example, a single peasant might not own an ox, let alone a team of oxen, necessary to pull the heavy, iron-tipped plow. So plowing became a communal activity. Villagers would pool their resources, oxen, plows, and labor, to ensure that everyone's strips were tilled. This meant that when the sun rose, signaling the ideal time to begin plowing in the spring, the entire community, or at least the able-bodied men, would rise almost in unison, heading out to the fields together. Their individual efforts were pointless without the collective. Similarly, harvesting, the most critical period of the agricultural year, was a massive communal undertaking. When the grain ripened, it had to be cut and threshed quickly to avoid spoilage from rain or pests. Every able-bodied person, from the youngest child capable of gleaning to the oldest, would be in the fields from dawn until dusk, working side by side. Imagine the scene. Hundreds of figures, bent over, moving in rhythmic unison across vast fields under the relentless summer sun, their movements dictated by the available light. The work began at first light, as soon as there was enough visibility to wield a sickle safely, and continued until the last glimmer of twilight made it impossible to see the stalks. This shared labor fostered incredible bonds, a sense of solidarity born from literally working together for shared survival. The sun didn't just illuminate their individual tasks, it synchronized their collective endeavor. Beyond the major agricultural tasks, many other aspects of daily life were communal and tied to the sun. Grazing livestock often happened on common pastures, requiring collective herding and management. Fetching water from the village well or stream was a shared morning chore, a time for brief social interaction and exchange of news before the day's heavy work began. Gathering firewood from communal woodlands would often involve groups, not just for efficiency, but for safety from wild animals or bandits. Even simple maintenance, like repairing a communal bridge or clearing a path, might be undertaken by the village collective. The absence of artificial timekeepers, as explored in Chapter 2, reinforced this communal rhythm. With no personal watches or digital clocks, the entire village relied on observable natural cues and, significantly, the communal bells of the church. The church bells, pealing at the canonical hours, matins, lauds, prime, etc., served as a public, audible clock, regulating the community's spiritual life and, by extension, their secular activities. While peasants might not have stopped work for every single prayer, the bells marked distinct phases of the day: morning prayer, midday break, evening vespers, creating a shared temporal framework that everyone recognized and generally adhered to. When the bells rang for matins at dawn, it wasn't just a signal to pray, but a general call to begin the day's activities. This strong sense of community provided both support and oversight. If a family fell ill or faced a crisis, neighbors would step in to help with their fields, knowing that their own survival might one day depend on similar reciprocity. This informal social safety net was crucial in a world without state welfare. However, this close-knit existence also meant constant social pressure. Everyone was aware of everyone else's work ethic, their contributions to the common good. Shirkers would be quickly identified, and social ostracism was a powerful deterrent. This collective scrutiny ensured that individuals pulled their weight, aligning their personal efforts with the community's needs, particularly when the sun demanded long hours of labor. The village leadership, often including the local lord's bailiff or the village elders, would also play a role in coordinating communal work. Decisions about when to begin plowing, when to harvest, or when to let livestock onto common fallow fields were made collectively or by respected figures, ensuring efficiency and fairness. These decisions were inherently tied to the progression of the seasons and the availability of daylight. The act of waking up with the sun was, therefore, not just an individual response to natural light, but a deeply communal one. It was a shared experience, reinforced by the sights and sounds of the entire village stirring to life simultaneously. The smoke rising from neighboring chimneys, the distant sounds of other families' animals, the general increase in activity across the settlement, all these sensory cues reinforced the idea that everyone was doing the same thing, responding to the same ancient call. This collective awakening instilled a sense of shared purpose and belonging, a feeling that they were all in this challenging world together, facing its demands as one unit. This focus on the collective naturally led to a different concept of leisure and social life. While private moments existed, much of their social interaction revolved around communal gatherings and shared activities. Feasts, market days, religious festivals, and even simple evening storytelling by the fire were inherently communal events. These would take place during daylight hours or early evening, again dictated by the sun's presence. The lack of private, artificial lighting for individual pursuits meant that social life was often a collective endeavor, reinforcing bonds and sharing experiences within the village. In essence, medieval European society, especially its agrarian core, was an intricate web of interdependence. The sun, as the ultimate timekeeper and enabler of life-sustaining work, was the silent conductor of this collective symphony. It ensured that the individual rhythm harmonized with the communal pulse. Rising with the sun was a daily act of reaffirming one's place within this vital, interconnected whole, a testament to the enduring power of community in a world where shared effort was the only path to survival. Their world was a testament to the fact that when you live by the sun, you often live by and for each other. In our modern secularized societies, the act of waking up often involves a quick check of news headlines, social media, or work emails. For many, spirituality, if it exists at all, is a private, often segmented part of life, perhaps reserved for a specific day of the week or a quiet moment of personal reflection. But journey back to medieval Europe, and you would find a world where the sacred and the mundane were inextricably intertwined. Faith was not a Sunday-only affair. It was the very air they breathed, the lens through which they understood the world, and a profound force that dictated the rhythm of their daily lives, particularly their mornings. The sun, as the ultimate symbol of God's creation and light, played a pivotal role in this spiritual awakening, giving rise to practices that aligned human time with divine time. The dominance of the Church. The Catholic Church was the undisputed spiritual and often political and social center of medieval life. Its influence permeated every aspect of existence, from birth to death, from the grandest king's court to the humblest peasant's cottage. Religious doctrine provided comfort, meaning, and a moral framework. It also provided a structure for time itself, one that complemented and often superseded the purely natural solar clock. Central to this structure were the canonical hours, also known as the divine office, or the liturgy of the hours. These were specific times of prayer and psalmody observed by clergy, monks, and nuns throughout the day and night. While the laity, common people, might not have observed every single hour with the same rigor, the very existence of these prayers shaped the communal understanding of time and subtly influenced their own rhythms. Let's look at how the early hours were specifically tied to this spiritual framework. Matins, vigils. This was often the earliest service, held in the dead of night, typically between midnight and 3 a.m. While not directly tied to the sun's rise, its performance by monks and devout clergy meant that even in the profound darkness, human activity in the name of God was stirring. The quiet chanting in the cold, shadowy abbey church would be a stark contrast to the sleeping world outside, a testament to spiritual dedication. For the layperson, even if they weren't participating, the very knowledge of these prayers being offered could instill a sense of the night having its own sacred purpose, a preparation for the dawn. Lauds. This hour was explicitly tied to dawn and the first light. The name itself comes from praises, referring to the hymns sung at sunrise. As the first faint streaks of gray light began to appear in the eastern sky, monks and clergy would gather to offer prayers of thanksgiving for the new day and for the light of Christ dispelling the darkness. This was a direct spiritual acknowledgement of the sun's return. For the common folk, if a monastery was nearby, the distant bells ringing for lauds would be a clear, audible signal that dawn was truly upon them, even before the sun appeared over the horizon. It reinforced the idea that the day began not just physically, but spiritually. Prime, meaning first hour. Prime was traditionally recited around 6 a.m., just after sunrise. It was a prayer to sanctify the beginning of the workday, committing the day's labors to God. This hour particularly resonated with the daily practicalities, blessing the hands and tools that would soon be engaged in work. While the monastic life imposed the most rigid adherence to these hours, the common people were nonetheless touched by this spiritual clock. The village church bells would often ring for at least prime, terce, mid-morning, sext, midday, none, mid-afternoon, vespers, sunset, and compline, before sleep. These bells were the public clock of the medieval world, regulating not just church services, but also market activities, meal times, and the general ebb and flow of daily life. When the prime bell rang, a peasant in the field might pause for a moment of silent prayer, crossing themselves before returning to their work. It was a brief, yet significant acknowledgement of divine time woven into the fabric of their secular day. Morning prayer and personal devotion. Beyond the communal aspect of church bells, individual and family prayer was a fundamental part of the medieval morning. Upon rising, after their simple wash and before their sparse meal, many would take a moment for personal devotion. This might involve reciting the Lord's Prayer, Pater Noster, or the Hail Mary, Ave Maria. These were foundational prayers taught from childhood, making the sign of the cross a simple yet powerful act of faith. Giving thanks for surviving the night and for the new day, praying for protection and success in the day's labors. For those with access to a book of hours, a personal prayer book, a luxury item for the wealthy, they might recite the relevant prayers for prime or lauds privately, mirroring the monastic practice. These morning prayers were not just rote recitations. They were a deeply felt connection to the divine, an acknowledgement of God's omnipresence. The very act of waking up was seen as a gift, a fresh opportunity to live righteously and serve God. This spiritual grounding provided a sense of purpose and meaning to the often harsh and unpredictable realities of medieval life. It offered comfort in a world where disease, famine, and violence were constant threats. The sun as a divine symbol. The sun itself was often imbued with deep spiritual significance. In Christian theology, Christ is frequently referred to as the Sun of Righteousness, or the light of the world. The rising sun, therefore, became a powerful metaphor for resurrection, for new beginnings, and for the triumph of divine light over the darkness of sin and ignorance. Waking with the sun was not just a practical necessity, it was a symbolic act, a daily affirmation of faith, a living out of the spiritual narrative. The beauty of the sunrise, the gradual dispelling of shadows, the warmth returning to the world, these natural phenomena were seen as direct manifestations of God's power and benevolence. To greet the dawn was to greet God's continued creation, to witness His daily miracle. This deep spiritual connection elevated the simple act of waking from mere routine to a profound moment of contemplation and gratitude. Fear of the night and redemption through day. Conversely, the darkness of the night was often associated with evil, temptation, and the forces of chaos. As we discussed in Chapter 3, the night was a time of increased danger, both real and imagined, demons, spirits. Therefore, the arrival of dawn wasn't just a practical relief, but a spiritual redemption. It was a tangible sign that the forces of good had prevailed, that the world was safe once more under the benevolent light of God. This heightened the sense of gratitude and urgency in their morning prayers. They were literally praying for and celebrating the return of light, both physical and spiritual. This pervasive spiritual connection meant that even the humblest peasant, working their field under the early morning sun, was engaged in a form of silent prayer, a communion with creation. Their labor was not just a means of sustenance, it was a way of honoring God, of fulfilling their role in the divine plan. The very rhythm of their lives, dictated by the sun, was a living liturgy, a continuous act of worship. The medieval morning was thus a confluence of the practical and the sacred. The biological imperative to rise with the light for work was seamlessly interwoven with a profound spiritual impulse to greet the dawn with prayer and thanksgiving. For our ancestors, waking up was not just about starting another day. It was about participating in a cosmic dance between light and darkness, between the earthly and the divine, a daily reaffirmation of their place in a God-centered universe. This deep spiritual grounding was as fundamental to their early rising as the demands of the fields or the absence of artificial light, creating a rich tapestry of meaning around every sunrise. We have seen how the daily arc of the sun dictated the rising and resting of medieval people, but the sun's influence was far grander than a mere 24-hour cycle. Its annual journey across the sky, bringing the dramatic shifts of the seasons, profoundly reshaped the very fabric of life, especially the patterns of sleep and activity. For us, in our climate-controlled, perpetually lit homes, the difference between a winter night and a summer night might be a few degrees on the thermostat, or the length of our commute in daylight. For our medieval ancestors, it was a fundamental reordering of existence, a shift from intense, sun-driven labor to a period of forced introspection and resource conservation, directly impacting when and how they slept. Winter, the long nights of rest and endurance. Imagine the depth of a medieval winter. The days were brutally short, often lasting only 8 or 9 hours in northern Europe, with the sun hanging low and pale in the sky, offering little warmth or direct light. The nights, conversely, were extraordinarily long, stretching for 15 or 16 hours, plunged into the profound darkness we discussed earlier. This wasn't merely a backdrop for their lives. It was a dominant, often harsh force that dictated their activities and, crucially, their sleep. With the lack of abundant natural light, productive outdoor labor on the fields largely ceased. The ground was often frozen solid or covered in snow, making plowing or sowing impossible. Animals, too, were less active, requiring less strenuous care. This reduction in daylight hours inherently meant a significant decrease in the available time for most forms of work. People couldn't simply light more candles or oil lamps to extend their day, as these were expensive, dim, and smoky, offering only localized illumination. Consequently, sleep patterns adapted significantly during winter. The concept of hibernation for humans, while not literal, takes on a certain resonance here. People would naturally spend more time in bed, embracing the extended hours of darkness. The first sleep might begin even earlier, perhaps shortly after 7 or 8 p.m., as soon as the last embers of twilight faded and the cold began to truly bite. This deeper initial rest was essential for bodies depleted by meager winter diets and the constant battle against the cold. The waking hour during winter nights might also have been longer or more pronounced. With less pressing work to do during the day, this middle-of-the-night interlude could become a time for extended storytelling around the fire, for quiet contemplation, mending clothes, or perhaps even weaving by the firelight, as these were indoor tasks, less dependent on bright natural light. The social and introspective aspects of biphasic sleep were amplified by the winter gloom. It was a period for internal life, for strengthening family bonds through shared quiet moments. The very slowness of winter fostered patience and a different kind of productivity, a mental and social one, rather than purely physical. The second sleep would then carry them through until the faint, distant promise of dawn, which would arrive much later than in summer. Waking in winter was often a slow process, battling the pervasive cold that seeped into every corner of their unheated homes. The motivation to rise wasn't the immediate, urgent call of the fields, but the slow, gradual return of enough light to begin indoor chores, like preparing a sparse breakfast or tending to confined livestock. The winter rhythm was one of conservation, conserving energy, conserving food, and conserving warmth, with sleep acting as a primary tool for all three. Summer, the long days of relentless toil. Now, contrast this with the boundless energy and relentless demands of summer. In Northern Europe, summer days could stretch for 16 or even 17 hours of daylight, with the sun high and bright in the sky from early morning until late evening. This was the period of peak agricultural activity, a frantic race against time to produce enough food to last through the leaner months. The very survival of the community depended on maximizing every available moment of light. Sleep patterns during summer were consequently shorter and often more fragmented. The first sleep might be delayed until well after 9 or 10 p.m. as people pushed themselves to work as long as there was usable light. A farmer might come home, eat a quick meal, and then almost immediately collapse into bed, only to rise again for their waking hour, or more likely, be roused by the first hints of dawn or the urgency of their animals. The second sleep would be shorter, often punctuated by the early arrival of the sun. The sheer volume of work in summer meant that sleep was often seen as a necessary, but grudgingly taken, break. Hay had to be cut, dried, and stored before rain. A constant threat could spoil it. Grain crops, the most vital, needed to be weeded, tended, and eventually harvested under the relentless summer sun. Every hour of daylight was a precious resource to be exploited to its fullest. There was little time for leisure, extensive social gatherings, or quiet contemplation in the middle of the night. The urgency of the harvest, the need to secure food, superseded almost everything else. Even the types of dreams might have shifted. After a long, physically exhausting day under the hot sun, the first sleep would be deep and heavy. The second sleep, potentially lighter, might be filled with dreams reflecting the day's anxieties and tasks, fields, crops, the weather. The body, constantly pushed, would seek whatever restorative rest it could get, often in shorter, more intense bursts. The contrast in morning routines was stark. In summer, the awakening was rapid and purposeful. The sun, bursting over the horizon, felt like an immediate command. The air was often warm even at dawn, and the urgency of outdoor tasks meant little lingering. Breakfasts were still simple, but consumed with an even greater sense of haste. fueling bodies for an immediate return to the demanding fields. The sounds of summer mornings were louder, more active, the clatter of tools, the shouts of farmers, the constant buzz of insects, the chirping of birds. Adaptation and resilience. This seasonal fluctuation in sleep and activity patterns highlights the incredible adaptability and resilience of medieval people. Their bodies were finely tuned to the natural world, operating without the artificial buffer of modern technology. They knew instinctively when to push themselves to their physical limits, summer, and when to conserve energy and rest more, winter. Their lives were a continuous ebb and flow, mirroring the greater cycles of the earth. The longer, darker winters reinforced the social and spiritual aspects of life. More storytelling, more indoor crafts, more religious devotion. The abundant, bright summers demanded relentless physical labor and a more external, communal focus. The concept of wasting time would have differed drastically by season. In summer, every moment counted for survival, while in winter, time might be seen as a period for necessary recovery and preparation. This deep integration with seasonal rhythms is a stark contrast to our contemporary world, where artificial light and climate control have largely decoupled our bodies from the planet's natural cycles. We often experience winter blues or fatigue, perhaps because our bodies are still subtly wired for that medieval need to slow down and conserve, while our modern lives continue at the same relentless pace year-round. For the medieval person, rising with the sun was not a uniform experience throughout the year. It was a flexible, adaptive response to the sun's ever-changing presence, a testament to a life lived in profound harmony with the Earth's grand seasonal dance. They didn't just adapt to the seasons, they were the seasons, their very being shaped by the interplay of light and darkness, warmth and cold, abundance and scarcity throughout the annual cycle. This understanding deepens our appreciation for their remarkable ability to thrive in a world so utterly different from our own. We've journeyed deep into the medieval past, exploring a world where the rising sun was not merely a picturesque event, but the absolute, undeniable master of daily life. From the peasant to the prince, from the artisan to the abbot, everyone's rhythm was synchronized with the celestial clock. Their homes were dark, their work was physical, and their very survival depended on maximizing daylight hours. But human ingenuity, driven by necessity and curiosity, would slowly begin to challenge this ancient dominion. The story of why people no longer primarily rise with the sun is a tale of gradual, transformative innovations, each building upon the last, fundamentally reshaping our relationship with time, light, and sleep. The first significant shifts began subtly, even within the medieval period itself. While most people lived in profound darkness after sunset, a slow evolution in artificial lighting laid the groundwork for future changes. For centuries, the primary sources were the flickering, smoky hearth fire, rudimentary rushlights, and expensive tallow candles. These offered limited, localized illumination. But as towns grew and trade expanded, a slightly wider array of lighting options, though still primitive by modern standards, became available to those who could afford them. Beeswax candles, for instance, burned brighter and cleaner than tallow, becoming a symbol of wealth and piety. Oil lamps, fueled by various oils, Animal fat, fish oil, vegetable oil provided a slightly more consistent light than rush lights and could be made somewhat more efficient over time. These small improvements, however, did not fundamentally alter the dominance of natural light. They merely offered brief, costly extensions to the day for specific, often wealthy, purposes. A vast majority still retreated into darkness once the sun set. The truly revolutionary change began not with light, but with timekeeping. For millennia, the sun had been the only reliable clock. Sundials, water clocks, clepsydras, and sand glasses offered rudimentary ways to mark intervals, but they were often inaccurate, weather-dependent, or required constant manual resetting. The late medieval period, specifically from the 13th and 14th centuries onwards, witnessed the nascent development of the mechanical clock. These early clocks were monumental public structures, often installed in church towers or town halls. They were clunky, inaccurate by our standards, often losing or gaining several minutes a day, and required constant maintenance by specialized clock keepers. However, their very existence represented a profound conceptual leap. For the first time, time was being measured not by the immutable celestial bodies, but by human-made mechanisms. The ringing of these public clocks with their hourly chimes began to provide a more standardized, audible rhythm to urban life, supplementing the church bells. Merchants could now agree on precise meeting times, artisans could work to a more structured schedule, and town life gained a new temporal precision. This mechanical time, though initially imperfect, slowly began to decouple daily activities from the absolute reign of the sun. People might still rise with the natural light, but their work and social lives were increasingly segmented by these artificial, human-imposed markers. The next great leap came with the printing press in the 15th century. While not directly related to light, the spread of literacy and the increasing availability of books meant that more people, particularly in urban centers, began to engage in activities that required extended periods of good light, such as reading and scholarship. This created a demand for better and more affordable lighting solutions, pushing innovation forward. But it was the Industrial Revolution, beginning in the late 18th century and truly taking hold in the 19th, that delivered the most seismic shift. The invention of the gas lamp in the late 18th century and its widespread adoption for street lighting and indoor illumination in the early 19th century transformed urban landscapes. Cities that had once plunged into darkness after sunset now glowed with a new, continuous, and relatively bright light. Suddenly, the night was conquered. Factories could operate 24 hours a day, establishing shift work and demanding that laborers report for duty regardless of the sun's position. Taverns, theaters, and shops could stay open late, creating a vibrant nightlife that had been impossible before. The concept of working hours became detached from daylight, instead being dictated by the needs of the machines and the economy. The mass production of oil lamps, using refined whale oil or kerosene, also made brighter, cleaner, and more affordable indoor illumination available to a wider segment of the population. Homes, once largely dark after dusk, could now be reasonably lit for longer periods, enabling evening activities like reading, sewing, or social gatherings to extend well into the night. The biphasic sleep pattern, so natural for centuries, began to erode as people stayed up later, compressing their sleep into a single, longer block. The final blow to the sun's dominion came with the invention of the incandescent light bulb by Thomas Edison in the late 19th century, and its subsequent electrification of cities and homes throughout the 20th century. Electric light was revolutionary. It was bright, clean, relatively cheap, and instantly available at the flick of a switch. It offered unparalleled control over illumination. The night was no longer a barrier. It was an extension of the day, to be molded to human will. With ubiquitous electric light, society rapidly reorganized itself. Workplaces adopted fixed 9 to 5, or longer, schedules, entirely independent of sunrise and sunset. Commuting became commonplace, often in darkness both morning and evening. Entertainment, education, and social life increasingly shifted into the evening hours. The alarm clock, once a niche device for monks or specific trades, became a household necessity, ripping people from their natural sleep cycles to conform to an artificially imposed timeline. The body's natural melatonin production, once a clear signal for rest, became confused by constant exposure to bright indoor lights well into the night. This decoupling from the sun has had profound consequences. We gained productivity, efficiency, and a vibrant, extended social life. But we also lost our inherent connection to natural rhythms. Sleep deprivation has become a modern epidemic, with widespread health consequences. Our bodies, still largely programmed for a world of light and darkness, struggle to adapt to the constant artificial illumination. The very concept of rising with the sun has transformed from a fundamental imperative to a niche lifestyle choice, often embraced for health or mindfulness. From the simple turning of a sand glass to the complex glow of a smart device, the journey of timekeeping and artificial light has been one of humanity's most defining technological and social evolutions. It liberated us from the dictates of the natural world, granting us unprecedented control over our time and activities. But in gaining this control, we also moved away from an ancient harmony, trading the gentle call of the sun for the insistent beep of an alarm, a subtle but profound shift in the very fabric of human existence. The light we now command has indeed reshaped our nights, but it has also, perhaps unwittingly, reshaped our mornings, our bodies, and our very understanding of rest and wakefulness. The world outside your window is quiet now, isn't it? Perhaps the gentle hum of a distant refrigerator, the soft glow of a street lamp casting long, inky shadows, or the almost imperceptible whir of technology keeping watch over your slumber. It's a world that bends to your will, illuminated by the flick of a switch, warmed by a thermostat that responds to your merest whim, and brought to life by the simple touch of a screen. You rise when your alarm demands it, perhaps a gentle melody that gradually brightens, or a jarring beep that rips you from the depths of dreams. You have schedules meticulously planned in 15-minute increments, meetings that dictate your presence across time zones, and appointments that often stretch late into the night, blurring the lines between work and rest. It's a life defined by the relentless pace of constant light, constant connection, and an unyielding march forward, a perpetual state of on. But what if I told you there was a time, not so long ago in the grand, meandering tapestry of human history, when the world dictated the rhythm, not the other way around? A time when clocks were not tiny, intricate mechanisms on your wrist, nor glowing digital displays, but grand celestial bodies traversing the vast, untamed sky. A time when the concept of pulling an all-nighter was not a badge of honor for diligent students or overworked professionals, but a desperate, dangerous necessity reserved for guarding the village from wolves or tending to a dying loved one. A time when every waking moment was intimately linked to the ebb and flow of natural light, and the very act of rising was a profound communion with the dawn. And perhaps, if you're still awake tonight, if the quiet of your modern world allows your thoughts to wander into the mists of antiquity, I can tell you something. Old. Very old. Something about why, for centuries upon centuries, people didn't set a buzzing alarm, but simply rose with the sun, their bodies and souls aligned with its ancient, undeniable call. Imagine, for a moment, shedding the comforting mantle of electric lights, of instant illumination that banishes every shadow with the slightest gesture. Picture entire villages shrouded in an almost impenetrable velvet darkness once the sun dipped below the horizon, where the only illumination came from the flickering, dancing flames of central hearths, the meager, sputtering glow of a tallow candle, or perhaps a rushlight, barely pushing back the encroaching, swallowing night. This wasn't merely a lack of convenience or a slight inconvenience. It was a fundamental transformative shift in how life was lived, how human activity was structured, and how the very concept of time was perceived. The night was a different entity altogether, a realm of profound rest, of deep silence, of potential dangers that stirred in the unseen, and of introspection born from the absence of external stimulation. It was a time for things that could be done in the dark, or not at all. For the vast majority of people inhabiting medieval Europe, spanning the rich centuries from the 9th to the 15th, from the bustling, mud-strewn market towns to the quiet, sprawling fields that fed the populace, the sun wasn't just a distant source of warmth or a convenient marker of midday. It was the very pulse of their existence, the master conductor of their daily symphony, the omnipresent force shaping every breath and every task. Their days were not measured by the precise tick-tock of minutes and seconds, a concept still nascent and largely irrelevant to most. Instead, they were marked by the grand, sweeping arc of the sun across the sky. The subtle, almost imperceptible shifts in light from gray dawn to golden noon, and the lengthening or shortening of shadows that stretched like silent fingers across the landscape. It was a life intricately woven into the raw, unmediated fabric of the natural world, dictated by the unyielding cycles of dawn and dusk, the patient growth of the earth, and the rhythmic ebb and flow of the seasons. Their survival, quite literally, depended on understanding and aligning with these ancient, immutable laws. We, ensconced in our modern comforts and shielded by layers of technology, might find it hard to truly grasp this profound, visceral connection to the natural world. We are insulated from the raw, undeniable power of nature's elements, from the biting cold that creeps into an unheated home to the intense heat of a summer field. But for them, the rising sun was not merely a picturesque event to be admired from a comfortable window seat. It was a profound, daily rebirth. It was the unequivocal signal for life to begin anew, for chores to commence, for work to be done. It was the moment when the chilling dampness of the night began to recede, when the mist lifted from the low-lying fields revealing their hidden promise, and when the urgent tasks of survival, the very essence of their being, demanded immediate and sustained attention. In the coming chapters, as the flames in our narrative hearth continue to flicker and cast their dancing light, we will journey back in time. We will not dwell on the grand battles that reshaped kingdoms, nor on the towering cathedrals that reached for the heavens, for those are tales for another time. Instead, our focus will be on the quiet, dusty, yet endlessly fascinating corners of everyday life. We will seek to understand the subtle forces that compelled our ancestors to greet each new day with the very first whisper of light. We'll explore the practicalities of their rudimentary existence, the deeply held beliefs that shaped their world, and the subtle yet powerful rhythms that governed their mornings, and ultimately permeated their entire lives. Prepare to step into a world where time truly began with the sun, where the break of dawn was not an event to be missed, but a sacred, vital call to embrace another day of existence. It is a story of human adaptation, resilience, and a lost harmony with the cosmic dance of light and shadow.